They said it was a fortress. They said the regime was invincible, entrenched by 25 years of iron-fisted control and backed by global superpowers. But this week, the world woke up to an image that history will never forget. The president of Venezuela handcuffed on a plane bound for New York. The operation, codenamed Absolute Resolve, didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the explosive finale to a drama that has been building for decades, a story of stolen dreams, vanished wealth, and a population pushed to the absolute brink. While the headlines are screaming about the military strike, they are missing the real story. This wasn't just about a dawn raid in 2026, it was about the millions of voices that were silenced in 2024. To understand why American forces landed in Caracas this January, we have to go back to the moment the fuse was lit. If you want to find the exact moment the regime signed its own death warrant, you have to look at July 28, 2024. That was Election Day. For the first time in years, there was a genuine electricity in the air. The opposition had rallied behind a quiet diplomat named Edmundo Gonzalez, standing in for the fiery band leader Maria Corina Machado. The plan was simple: overwhelm the rigged system with so many votes that the fraud would be impossible to hide. And the Venezuelan people delivered. They stood in lines that wrapped around city blocks, enduring heat, intimidation, and delays. By the time the polls closed, the exit polls were clear. It was a landslide, a 70-30 blowout for the opposition. But then, the lights went out, literally and metaphorically. The regime-controlled Electoral Council paused the transmission of results. Hours later, without a single shred of proof, they declared Nicolas Maduro the winner with 51% of the vote. They thought that would be the end of it. They thought people would go home, cry, and accept another 6 years. They were wrong. In a stunning act of civilian bravery, thousands of poll watchers, ordinary citizens, grandmothers, students, had secretly kept the paper, tally sheets printed by the voting machines. They hid them in shoeboxes, under mattresses, and in backpacks. Within 48 hours, the opposition digitized and published over 80% of these receipts online. The math was undeniable. The world could see the actual signatures and the actual numbers. The regime hadn't just stolen an election, they had been caught red-handed by their own people. This was the point of no return. The regime responded not with a recount, but with a crackdown, Operation Knock Knock, arresting thousands. But the legitimacy was gone. The clock had started ticking. 2025 was the year Venezuela went dark. In January, the regime staged a hollow inauguration ceremony. The streets, usually vibrant with protest or celebration, were eerily quiet. It was the silence of a population held hostage. Most democratic nations refused to send ambassadors. The seats reserved for the European Union, the United States, and most of Latin America sat empty. The message was clear: you are alone. But isolation makes a wounded animal dangerous. Cut off from legitimate markets, the regime stopped pretending to be a government and started operating like a cartel. They liquidated the nation's gold reserves, loading bars onto mystery planes bound for unregistered airfields in the Middle East and Africa. They turned the Orinoco mining arc into a lawless zone, where environmental destruction funded their survival. This was the shift that changed everything in Washington. For years, the US had treated this as a diplomatic puzzle, something to be solved with sanctions and negotiations. But throughout 2025, intelligence reports landing on the desk of the President of the United States painted a different picture. Venezuela was no longer just a dictatorship. It had become a forward operating base for every enemy of the West. The Tren de Aragua, a gang born in a Venezuelan prison, had metastasized into a transnational threat, moving drugs and chaos across the US border. Iranian and Russian operatives were reportedly given free rein in Caracas to set up surveillance stations. The final straw wasn't politics, it was security. By late 2025, the diplomatic backchannels went dead. The regime, paranoid and broke, made a fatal miscalculation. They detained US citizens on trumped-up charges to use as bargaining chips. They thought they were buying leverage. Instead, they were buying a war. The President of the United States stopped asking for compliance and started planning for removal. The time for talk had officially run out. To really grasp why this week's events were inevitable, you have to understand the tragedy of the Venezuelan economy. It wasn't always a disaster zone. In the 1970s, Venezuela was the envy of Latin America. They called it Saudi Venezuela. It was so wealthy that the Concorde supersonic jet flew regular routes from Paris to Caracas. The country floated on an ocean of oil, holding the largest proven reserves on the planet, more than Saudi Arabia, more than the United States. But oil is a dangerous drug if you don't respect it. And when Hugo Chavez took power in 1999, the price of a barrel of oil was skyrocketing. The government suddenly had more money than it knew what to do with. They spent billions on social programs, which was popular, but they made a fatal error. They stopped producing anything else. They seized private farms, factories and businesses, turning them over to state managers who didn't know how to run them. Production halted. Venezuela began importing everything, from beef to toilet paper, paid for with that oil cash. Then, they gutted the golden goose. In the early 2000s, the regime fired nearly 20,000 geologists, engineers, and experts from the state oil company, PDVSA, for political disloyalty. They replaced world-class scientists with political cronies. So, when oil prices crashed in 2014, the trap snapped shut. The money ran out, but there was no domestic industry left to feed the people. The government started printing money to pay bills, triggering one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in human history. Prices didn't just double. They rose by 130,000% in a single year. A month's salary couldn't buy a carton of eggs. The richest country in the region had starved itself to death, creating the vacuum that allowed criminal empires to take root. While the economy was flatlining, the soul of the nation was bleeding out across the borders. It started as a trickle of professionals, doctors and engineers catching flights to Miami or Madrid. But by 2018, it had become a river of desperate humanity walking on foot. They were known as Los Caminantes, the walkers. This wasn't just migration, it was an evacuation. Over nearly a decade, roughly 8 million Venezuelans fled their homeland. That is nearly a quarter of the entire population. Imagine if the entire population of New York City and Chicago just packed a bag and vanished. That is the scale of the emptiness left behind. The journey they took became a horror story of the modern age. Millions crossed the Simón Bolívar Bridge into Colombia, carrying their entire lives in tricolor backpacks. But the most harrowing path was north, through the Darien Gap, a dense, lawless jungle connecting South and Central America. It's a place where nature tries to kill you with venomous snakes and flash floods, and if nature doesn't, the cartels will. Yet hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan families, clutching toddlers and supporting grandparents, risked this nightmare. Why? Because the possibility of death in the jungle was less terrifying than the certainty of starvation at home. Back in Venezuela, the country was being hollowed out. Hospitals had no doctors. Schools had no teachers. A generation of children grew up with parents they only saw on video calls, raised by grandparents who were surviving on remittances sent from abroad. This mass displacement destabilized the entire Western Hemisphere, straining resources from Bogotá to the southern border of the United States. The regime didn't just break Venezuela, they created a humanitarian shockwave that no border wall could contain. The end, when it finally came, didn't look like a Hollywood blockbuster with explosions and tanks rolling down the streets. It was silent, precise, and terrifyingly fast. At 030 hours on January 3rd, 2026, the Caribbean skyline went dark. A massive cyber warfare operation, coordinated from the Pentagon, blinded the regime's radar systems and severed communications between the military high command and their barracks. In the confusion, they didn't see what was coming. The President of the United States had authorized Operation Absolute Resolve, not as an invasion, but as a surgical extraction. While the world slept, elite U.S. forces, supported by regional intelligence assets, breached the perimeter of Fuerte Tuna, the military fortress in Caracas, where the dictator had been sleeping for months, too paranoid to stay at the presidential palace. There was no prolonged firefight. The regime's loyalty, bought with stolen money, evaporated the moment the outcome became clear. Most of the guards simply put down their weapons. By the time the sun rose over the Avila Mountain, the news was breaking across secure channels. The man who had vowed to rule for 1,000 years was in custody, secured on a transport aircraft heading north. There were no speeches from him, no defiant last stands, just a quiet surrender in the pre-dawn light. When citizens in Caracas woke up, they found the streets padded by foreign troops and local soldiers who had tied white armbands to their uniforms, a signal of surrender and transition. The internet, throttled for years, suddenly lit up with the one image the regime had tried to prevent for a decade. The dictator, stripped of his sash and his power, looking small and defeated. The fortress had fallen. So, here we are. It is January 6, 2026. The dictator is sitting in a federal holding cell in New York, and the streets of Caracas are filled with a strange, heavy mixture of jubilation and terror. The statue has been toppled, but the pedestal is still standing. The removal of one man does not fix a broken nation overnight. Today, Venezuela is staring into a dangerous power vacuum. The opposition, led by the legitimate election winners, is currently scrambling to form a transition government. They are walking into ministry buildings that have been looted, facing computers with wiped hard drives, and inheriting a treasury that is effectively empty. The military, the wild card in this deck, is currently holding its breath. While the high command has been neutralized or captured, thousands of mid-level officers are armed and uncertain of their future. Will they support the transition, or will they fracture into warlords? The President of the United States has pledged humanitarian aid and security support, but has made it clear the rebuilding must be Venezuelan-led. For the people on the ground, the reality is still harsh. The water taps didn't magically start flowing this morning. The hyperinflation didn't vanish the moment the plane wheels left the tarmac. Families are still hungry. But for the first time in 25 years, there's something new in the air. Oxygen. The suffocating weight of inevitable oppression is gone. They're no longer prisoners in their own country. The road ahead is going to be long, messy, and difficult, but at least finally the road is open. This is history unfolding in real time, and the story of Venezuela's liberation is just beginning. We are going to be tracking every development, from the criminal trials in New York to the first free elections in Caracas, right here on this channel. We want to hear from you. Do you think the transition will be peaceful, or are we looking at a long period of instability? And what should the international community do with Venezuela's oil now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you found this breakdown helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us keep doing this work. We are already working on our next deep dive, the missing billions. Where did Venezuela's gold go? You won't want to miss that. Stay tuned, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.